On Sunday, June 22nd, 1958, a woman's body was found along a service road on the grounds of Arroyo High School in El Monte, California. A group of little leaguers and their coaches spotted her. She was Caucasian, red-headed, and fair-skinned, approximately 40 years of age. She was lying flat on her back a few inches off of the curb line. Her right arm was bent upward, and her right hand was resting just above her head. Her left arm was bent at the elbow and draped across her midriff. Her left hand was clenched and legs were outstretched. One of the coaches ran across Tyler Avenue and used a payphone that stood at the dairy that is now a McDonald's. So probably about 5 years ago, I'd say, it was 2015, I was scrolling through Netflix and I come across this project or movie or documentary titled Feast of Death. So clicked it and checked it out. And I had heard of James Ellroy before from LA Confidential. You know, I don't know much else about him, at least at that point I didn't. And I watched it, and I've watched it a lot, The Feast of Death. I mean, I've watched it a lot this year. I've watched it a lot back when it was on Netflix. You know, now I can check it out on YouTube or whatever. I didn't get the book right away, My Dark Places, which covers the murder of James Ellroy's mother, which is who we mentioned in the opening here. It was June 21st is a Saturday night. June 22nd is when they found her. So, Feast of Death has James Ellroy sitting with a group of LAPD detectives. Nick Nolte comes in there too for a little bit and has a seat with them, and they discuss crime, LA crime. They discuss the murder of James's mother. They discuss Elizabeth Short's murder. A very, very interesting project. If you guys ever want to check it out, it's called Feast of Death. So anyways, it took me about 5 years to finally get My Dark Places. I should have got it a lot sooner. But I finally got it and read it this year. And it was, I zipped right through that thing. It was intense, It starts you right off with the first line saying some kids found her, and that's what it was. It was a group of little leaguers and a few coaches that were going on a Sunday morning to the playing field there at Arroyo High School, and that's where they come across the body of Gene Ellroy. So the way it lays out in My Dark Places, he describes Tyler Avenue as running north and south, and Kings Row, which was the service road on the grounds of Arroyo High School, running east and west. Well, as it stands now, that was 62 years ago. Now, north and south, the street there is Santa Anita Avenue. And Kings Row is still called Kings Row. So I'm assuming that, that the street name's changed. Her body was found 63 feet west of the first lock gate onto the grounds. You'll see she was here. There's a crack. Let me show you the crack in the concrete. The divider in the concrete. You'll note this. And then when I reference Feast of Death, you'll see where her body was found somewhere in here. I'm referencing that. It's pretty close. The McDonald's in front of me was a dairy before. So one of the coaches ran across the street and called the police department from a payphone across the street. The only thing I don't know of in regards to Kings Row, at least from the research that I did do on it, I notice now that as it heads west on the grounds, it banks right and it goes north for about I want to say 180 feet or something until it cuts over to Santa Anita Avenue. I'd imagine back then it did not do that. At least it wasn't mentioned in the book. I think back then Kings Row just went straight over to Tyler Avenue. So the interesting thing about the body dump there was on the east side of Kings Row is Cedar Avenue, and there's locked gates on that side. So the only way the killer got in was through Kings Row from Tyler Avenue. And I think that's very interesting to have somebody roll in there, and whether or not he committed the murder there, I mean, we'll discuss that a little bit later, to know that there's only one way in and one way out. So he'd have to go in, do his business, and U-turn out of there. So law enforcement were called, detectives rolled up, officers rolled up, but the two detectives taking charge of this case when they got there was a Sergeant Ward Hallinan and Jack Lawton. So, it was their scene at that point. At first sight, it appeared she may have been strangled by her brassiere because it was up around her neck. She did have one stocking on her left leg. The right one was gone. There were visible bruises and lacerations on her inner thighs, as well as a drag mark on her left hip. There was a broken car antenna in the road, and there were pearls, like off of a pearl necklace, sprawled about on the gravel there. Because her brassiere was up around her neck, investigators initially thought she was strangled by her bra, but that wasn't the case. As I mentioned before, she had one of her nylons was left on her left leg, and the right one was gone. Well, upon further review of the body, there were two things around her neck. Now, the first one was described as like a Venetian blind cord. At first, the investigators thought that it was her bra, that she was strangled with her bra because it was up around her neck. But upon looking at the body further, they found two things around her neck that strangled her. Now, the first one was like a cotton cord that you would have on Venetian blinds that you would pull down to open or close them, this type of thing. That was wrapped around her neck and knotted. So on one side of the knot on the Venetian cord, the rope was broken, which is why he put the right stocking of Jean around her neck to finish the job. Because, I mean, that's clear cut as far as why there would be two things around her neck. The first one failed, or he thought it failed, or maybe she was still breathing after it broke. At any rate, he wanted to finish the job, so he took her right stocking off, put that around her neck, and finished. I mentioned the pearls sprawled out on the ground in the gravel. Detectives strung that back together, and it was a perfect fit for Jean's necklace. So during the struggle, that all got busted up and dropped on the ground. The coroner rolled the body, and there was insect bites on her skin. And this is what happens on a lot of cases where a body is dumped in grass, or even doesn't even have to be grass. Once they lay there and they lay there long enough, it's going to attract insects. And she had numerous bites along her back. There was dew on her back as well. And dew on her back is a clear sign that she was dumped before sunrise. So the coroner guessed at that point how long she had been dead, and he was guessing about 8 to 12 hours. So right there on Kings Row, they placed Jean face up on a gurney. They stripped her down. They found dried blood on her right hand, as well as a laceration in the middle of her forehead. She was measured at about 66 inches, probably a $135. Her liver temperature was 90 degrees, and this led the coroner to call time of death between 3 and 5 a.m. And based on the timeline, which we'll go over in a little bit, that's about right. So as Jean's laying there, they noticed that her right nipple was missing an areola, and they can see the creased white scar tissue around it. So it was an older, either a surgery or an accident, whatever the case may be. It wasn't fresh, which is going to be a good identification marker, if they struggle to find who this is. That's something that you can track pretty easy, that type of surgery or that type of infection, whatever happened to her there. Some of the things they did was they gathered some samples of her pubic hair and the hair on top of her head. The rigor mortis was setting in, and her clenched hand had gone rigid. Her face was becoming slight purple at this point. It was a warm day, probably about 90 degrees at that point. the end of June, so they had to move quick on it. So now we'll get into the autopsy findings of Jean. The cause of death was asphyxia due to strangulation by ligature, and there were 2 ligatures around her neck. In this case, a totally quote-unquote occlusive double ligature around the victim's neck. And she was also in her menstrual phase. The coroner found a tampon lodged into the rear of the vaginal cavity, and his testing for spermatozoa was positive. So he scraped the spermatozoa and froze it, which, to this day, I wonder, was it enough to test it? I mean, do they still have it today? That would be the question I would ask. Now it's got to be somewhere. If it's frozen, I would imagine they could link it to, potential family member or something along those lines. He diagrammed 11 total wounds on Jean. Her alcohol reading was 0.08%. There were small carpet-like fibers under the victim's right middle fingernail, so they bagged the victim's clothes and both garrotes. The strangling cord measured out at about 17 inches, but knotted down to right at 3 inches. So think about that, 3 inches around her neck. It's insane. So based on the spermatozoa that they found, she obviously engaged in recent sexual intercourse and eaten a full meal 1 to 2 hours before her death. Her stomach contents, and this is going to be very important as they begin their investigation, there were whole kidney beans, meat shards, orange-yellow masses resembling carrots or squash, and yellowish masses resembling cheese. So back then, 1958, they would do radio bulletins, right? And APB. And, it was a pretty solid source to get the public involved. The radio call that went out at 10:10 a.m. Sunday is as follows. On June 22nd, 1958, the strangled body of a woman was found in the El Monte area. She has been identified as Jean Ellroy, also known as Jean Hilliker, also known as Geneva O. Ellroy. It is believed that the suspect either still has in his possession or has thrown away articles of victims' clothing and personal effects, including a purse, description unknown, keys to victim's 1957 Buick, a pair of women's shoes, possibly clear plastic with high heels, a woman's underpants, girdle, and slip. A woman called in, and she said it sounded like her tenant. The way they described her over the radio sounded like her tenant. Her name was Anna Mae Creaky, and if I pronounced that wrong, my apologies. Her last name was spelled Krycki. They met up with her at her house, which sat on the corner at that time, the southeast corner of Maple Avenue and Bryant Road. It was 700 Bryant Road to be exact. And James Ellroy and his mother, they rented a little spot in that backyard, which is on the Maple Avenue side of the street. The Ellroy address was on the Maple Avenue side. Anyways, they roll over there to talk to Anna Mae Creaky and her husband. Mr. and Mrs. Creaky had a 12-year-old son. Well, it was actually Mrs. Creaky's son from another marriage. They all lived in the front house. I think Jean and her son had been staying there for about 4 months at that time. So they show up, kind of ask the usual questions about men and what her social life was like. And Mrs. Creaky, stuck to her guns on that, is that she didn't think Jean was a heavy drinker. She didn't think she had a boyfriend. She didn't go out much. So that left the detectives to think, okay, well, what else could it be, So then they asked Mr. Creaky his whereabouts Saturday night. Now, he stayed home and watched the fight, but he said he watched Jean leave the house between 8 and 8:30 p.m. She left alone, and that was it. Never came back, obviously. Okay, right now we're at 4026 Maple. Used to be 756 Maple. This is where James Ellroy and his mother Jean lived back in June 1958. This is the driveway she backed out of. She took off that fateful night. And unfortunately, we all know what happened next. But this is it right here in El Monte. James Ellroy's father, Armand, Detectives questioned him next, and his alibi checked out because he was with his son all weekend.
So we're here at 4980 Beverly. This is where James Ellroy and his father lived. James would come here on the weekends, and then to his mother's on the weekdays. Those back 3 windows there, and that little small window is where they lived. So after his mother was killed, his father was questioned, of course, and it all checked out. They were here that weekend.
Back to the Creaky residence. They searched it. They said it was nice and neat. It wasn't a mess. She did leave I think it was a half glass of wine on the table. Gene Ellroy drove a 1957 Buick. Now, during this time, they're looking for this Buick now. 1957 Buick. Officer Dave Wire was cruising around the El Monte 5 Points area and came across the car at 11721 Valley Boulevard, which was a bar restaurant called the Desert Inn. And it was parked in the back there, I think along the west side fence. Okay, so right now we're at 11721 Valley. This was the location of the Desert Inn. If you look at Google Earth, and you can even see it now, you can see the tar where it stood. The tar lines the square where it stood before Valenzuela restaurant. So after the Desert Inn, it was Valenzuela's, but it was all right here. If you go to Google Earth, 11721 Valley in El Monte, you can see the whole square. This is where the blonde woman, the swarthy man, and Gene Ellroy were hanging out that night. There's different accounts of when they were here, when they left. Myrtle Mobby and Bert Outlaw saw the swarthy man and Gene leave at 2 a.m. that night. And that puts them, after this, down at Stan's Drive-In. Another witness, Margie Trewick, she claims to have seen the blonde woman and Gene come into this place at about 10:30ish, somewhere in there, 10:45ish. I could be wrong there, but it was after 10. But it was right here. According to my calculations, they found her car over here. I want to say somewhere in here. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, you guys. So Dave Wire, one of the police officers, found her car parked here. They were going in and out from all the bars and stuff to find her vehicle, which was a 1957 Buick, red and white. They found it here. It was clean. It had empty beer cans in there wrapped up in a brown paper bag, and it was unlocked. But anyways, right here, the Desert Inn. This is incredible to be here because, again, getting a picture of what it looked like then versus being here now, it's surreal. I mean, this is where the blonde woman was seen with Gene Ellroy, and to me, this is one of the strong points of the case because many witnesses had seen her in here. She wasn't a regular though. They didn't recognize her to be a regular, nor was the swarthy man. But yeah, here we are. You can see here we're probably right about where it stood, right in here. They hit the dance floor, probably somewhere in here. I mean, just to be standing in this spot right now really ties it in once you read this book, My Dark Places, by James Ellroy. It's unlocked, it's clean inside. There's a half a dozen empty beer cans wrapped in like a paper, I don't know if it was a brown bag, but it was a brown paper, and I think it was tied up at the top. So while outside, there was 2 employees of the Desert Inn checking out the business to see what's going on, and detectives jammed them up. You know, hey, this is the deal. Do you recognize this woman, this car? Neither one of them did, but they did direct them to their manager, which was an Ellis Outlaw, I believe his name was. They talked to Ellis. Ellis didn't have any answers. He didn't recognize them, but he did say to talk to his wife, Alberta, and his sister, Myrtle Mobby, because they worked the night before. And, you know, that's a potential lead right there. So detectives talked to Myrtle Mobby and Alberta Outlaw, and they recognize Gene Ellroy. from being there the night before, but she's not a regular, nor was the man she was with. According to them, though, Gene Ellroy and this man, who they call the swarthy man, swarthy meaning dark complected, they said that the two of them closed the bar out at 2 a.m. Now this coincides with what happens next. A woman by the name of LaVon Chambers calls in and thinks that she knows something about the case because LaVon worked at a place called Stan's Drive-In, which is on the corner of Garvey and Valley, which is just down the street from the Desert Inn. And she's a car hop there. Now, according to her, she served that couple twice in the same night. So around 10, I want to say 10:20, 10:30, maybe shortly after 10, it could have been somewhere in there. She remembers waiting on that couple, and that Gene Ellroy was a very pleasant person, beautiful girl. LaVon remembered her dress. Now, according to LaVon, they came in the first time shortly after 10. Gene ordered a grilled cheese sandwich, and the man ordered a coffee. LaVon said that she was very sweet, personable, while the man seemed bored. He didn't say much. She remembered her specifically because of how beautiful she was and how beautiful Gene's dress was. Her idea of the man was that he was very thin, maybe 35 to 40 years old, driving a 55 or 56 old sedan, two-tone green color. He looked like he could be Greek or Italian. He didn't have an accent. He sounded like a Cali dude, but he didn't say much. They ate, they drove off. Now here's where it gets a little interesting. They come back. Now LaVon said it gets pretty packed in there when the bars close, so she was thinking anywhere between 2:15 to 2:45. They could have gotten there, but she waited on them again. Now this time, though, Gene looked a little disheveled. She looked like she had been out partying, drinking a little bit, but she was still pleasant. LaVon worded it as it looked like they were out necking or something, making out. But still pleasant, a little more tipsy. Now the guy, she said, had the same tone, just seemed bored, seemed sullen. He orders coffee again. But the key here is what Gene orders. Gene ordered chili and beans. And chili and beans with cheese on it. And this is what they found in Gene's stomach. So that's kind of forming the case right there. It's putting a timeline on things, So what we do know, based on the testimony of LaVon Chambers, is that they showed up at Stan's Drive-In twice within 4.5 hours. This is the location of what used to be the Stan's Drive-In. Now this is where Gene and the swarthy man came twice that night to eat. Once after 10 and once after 2, served by LaVon Pinky Chambers both times. The first time, Gene ordered a grilled cheese sandwich, I believe, and then the second time she ordered chili, and that's what they found during autopsy in her stomach was chili beans and cheese. The swarthy man ordered coffee both times. According to LaVon, he was quiet both times, seemed disinterested, bored, sullen. But again, 2 times in the same night, somewhere here in this parking lot. I couldn't find any reference pictures to what Stan's looked like at the time. But somewhere here, this is where they sat and ate. Just incredible to be here and kind of visualize that 62 years ago. There was another witness, Margie Trawick. I could be saying that wrong. Margie, Trawick. Now, she was there just hanging out at the Desert Inn that night. She arrived at about 10:10, was hanging out by herself. Now, according to Margie, Gene Ellroy walked in the Desert Inn with a dishwater blonde woman around the same age. Margie doesn't mention that the swarthy man walked in there with them, as 3. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just that's what Margie said. So she said they walked in at about 10:45 to 11. Now, she was saying it was a Mexican-looking man, immediately walked over to Gene, asked her to dance. And she jumped right up. He helped her take her coat off, laid it on the chair. He was about 5'8" to 6 foot, probably 35 to 40 years old. She said he had a swarthy complexion. And I think that's where the term swarthy originated in this case. I think it was from Margie, because that's just the way she described him. He had a dark suit on, according to her, with a white shirt open at the throat. This is one of the potential breaks in the cases. It wasn't a break, but it had so much room to be a break. There was this cat that was in there, a guy by the name of Mike Whitaker. He was a regular there, regular around the bars around town, a drinker. You know, guy's always out drinking, and so he's there. He's stumbling around. He's about 25 years old. He asks Margie to dance. She turns him down. He gets pissed. So he crashes the party of the swarthy man, the blonde, and Gene Ellroy, and sits with them for a little bit. He ends up dancing with this blonde woman. Tries to hit on Gene. She tells him no, she can't really hang out. You know, she's gotta have her son come back on Sundays, because James would come back Sunday nights because he'd be with her during the week. So she probably wasn't interested in this cat anyway. That's just what she said. Anyway, so Mike was pretty drunk. He was stumbling around, and from what I gathered from my dark places was that the swarthy man, Gene, and the blonde woman left just to get rid of this guy. But back to Margie. Now, Margie said she left the Desert Inn. Margie left at 11:30 because she went to run an errand for her friend. Some dude was there. She took him to go collect some money or pay some money. Margie comes back, I think at 1 or 1:10 or something like that, and was asked if the swarthy man, Gene Ellroy, and this blonde woman were still there. She said no. Well, she said she didn't see them. They weren't at the same table that they were at when Margie left. Now, it doesn't mean they weren't still there. I think they were probably still there, you know, just based on the timelines and everything. So, back to LaVon and her description, too. Here's another potential break in the case. It could have been a break in the case. The car hops were supposed to write down license plate numbers, you know, so the police can crack down on, you know, people that skip out on their checks. Well, you know, so busy that night, and LaVon just didn't do that. And she felt very, very bad over the years. It doesn't mean that would have caught this guy, you know. I mean, for all we know, maybe he didn't have any plates at that point, or they were fake plates. I mean, the guy seemed pretty comfortable in that stretch of street there between the Desert Inn to these, you know, Stan's Drive-In, that, you know, maybe for him he didn't feel he needed to have plates. But at any rate, she felt bad for not having the plates written down. So after speaking to Margie Trewick and LaVon Chambers, the police have sketch artists come in there and draw up what the two witnesses feel this guy looked like. Back then they were called identikits. Now, identikits back then were cardboard pages with different facial features printed on each of them, so you can mix and match a nose to a different chin and so forth. They came up with two different ones. They look a little different, but at the same time they resemble each other very much, and I'll put them up here so you can see the difference between the two. According to James Ellroy, LaVon's swarthy man looked like a lean face, average guy, while Margie's looked vicious. Having said that, they were similar in facial structure. So now let's get to the car. And that's another key piece of evidence that could really crack the case, you know. The best shot of this car getting identified was from LaVon Chambers, because she waited on it twice, and she was pretty confident in what kind of vehicle it was. She said it was a dark green Oldsmobile, either a 55 or a 56, most likely a 55 because of the paint, and it was a real dull finish. And in her opinion, it was a regular line version of the car, not a holiday version. As much as she's around cars, that should have some validity. So I guess the holiday version is a longer version of this vehicle. So I think we can pretty much go with that. It was a regular line old 55 or 56, and go with what LaVon said, because, you know, she saw him twice, and that's key. You'd think it would be key, but it didn't help out at this point. It sucks. Okay, so Mike Whitaker was named by a few of the patrons as far as he was dancing with the group. I think he even danced with Gene at one point, if I remember right. So they scrounged him up at another bar, hauled him in for questioning. He was getting a few things wrong as far as who's who and what's what. I mean, he was so drunk. But anyways, he does remember dancing with Gene. He remembers the swarthy man telling him his name. He thinks it might be Tommy, but he doesn't know. He doesn't remember for sure. But here's just so close but so far, because here's another cat that was sitting with them at the table. So between Mike Whitaker sitting at the table with them, being introduced to them, conversing with them, dancing with them, eating with them, and Levon Chambers, serving Gene and this swarthy man twice. The license plate wasn't jotted down. Again, that's no one's fault, but I'm just saying there are a couple of things that probably could have broke this case. That's a 62-year-old case. But one thing I do have a question about, if anyone can help me out with this, the spermatozoa sample or sperm sample that they scraped was frozen according to My Dark Places. Do they still have that sample? Is it still viable? Can they track it somehow? Because I think somebody told somebody who told somebody, even all these years later. It could be somebody's great-grandfather or grandfather or whatever the case is, that we can at least get some answers. There's never going to be closure, as James Ellroy clearly states, and he's right. But we still would like to know what happened. Who did it, and even more so, why did they do it? I personally think this guy lived in El Monte, lived nearby. He wasn't recognized as a familiar around there. Doesn't mean he wasn't around, but the familiarity that he had, it just seems that he knew the area, he knew the place. She worked at Airtech Dynamics, which was a place that made airplane parts. She was a nurse there at this building, and no one recognized the blonde woman, no one recognized the swarthy man. So where did she meet these people at? Where? At 8 o'clock that night, though, before she was even spotted at Stan's Drive-In, she was by herself, allegedly, at another bar in the area called the Manger. Did she meet somebody there and then say, hey, and then they made plans to meet at the Desert Inn? Was the blonde a friend, and was the friend of the swarthy man? Was it a hookup, a setup? There's so many questions about this case, and unsolved murders, unsolved crimes are fascinating, because you just think, man, that person's still out there, and if he's not, someone knows what happened, And this is a case here that I'd like to see some resolve to. I'd like to see something happen where it's brought to justice, or we know who did it. I wanted to go over some of Margie Trewick's investigation. We'll just call her Margie because I keep butchering that last name. So they sat her down and talked to her about the previous night, just to see what she got out of it. Now, I'll read the question, and then right after will be the answer. What time did you arrive at the Desert Inn? Margie answered, I would say about 10:15 to 10:20. So they go on to ask her, did anyone else seat themselves or come into the place that you took particular notice of? 2 girls, one a redhead and one is, I call a dishwater blonde, came in and sat down at the center table, center row. Now this is key here, because she claims to see the 2 women walk in together. She doesn't mention the swarthy man, so was the swarthy man already there? And if we're going by what I would say is the official timeline, we know that the swarthy man and Gene were at Stan's Drive-In just after 10. Would you describe these 2 ladies? Margie answers, the redhead was very attractive. I call it a Titan red. I don't know what you might call it. Not a dark red, not a light red. Very nicely dressed in a navy blue duster dress. At the time that they sat down, the waitress, which is a very dear friend of mine, was talking to a customer at the bar. What was the waitress's name? Myrtle Mobby. Now remember, Myrtle Mobby and Bert Outlaw claim that the swarthy man and Jean left the bar at 2 a.m. without the dishwater blonde. In reference to the swarthy man's interaction with Jean, here's what Myrtle had to say. From the way he approached the redhead, she arose from the chair. She took her coat off. He helped her fold it, lining out, put it across the back of the chair, and went to the dance floor. Now remember, Margie said she got there at about 10:15 to 10:20, so the detectives backed it up a little bit and said, okay, what time would you say the redhead and the dishwater blonde walked in? Margie's answer was, I would say I'd been there at least a half an hour, which would make it about 10:45. Here's another excerpt from My Dark Places by James Ellroy. I drew a Saturday night, Sunday morning time graph. I started at 7:56 Maple at 8 p.m. It ended at Arroyo High at 10:10 a.m. I placed my mother around 5 points hour by hour. I drew question marks to note her blocks of unaccountable time. I set her death at 3:15 a.m. I pinned the graph on the board. I tacked up a graphic crime scene shot at 3:20 a.m. This case is baffling because it's been 62 years and nothing. You know, I don't want to spoil the whole book, but in My Dark Places, James Ellroy becomes friends with an LAPD detective, Bill Stoner, and together they reopen the case and start investigating, 36 years later, 1994. And they're able to find this Mike Whitaker guy at some rundown hotel or motel, and he's not much of a help. He's still a drunk, and doesn't really recall much of the night. He said, I just danced with her. Most of the other witnesses are potential customers at the bars. They're either dead or sick, or handicapped. I mean, we're talking many, many years later. Memories fade, memories change. You have false memories, witness accounts change. These timelines, even from Margie to Myrtle to Bert, even Levon, I mean, they can be off a little bit, and one little thing off messes up the whole timeline, right? So we go by what we do know. We do know they came into Stan's drive-in twice, between just after 10 to just after 2. So in a 4.5 hour span, they were together because they were also seen at the Desert Inn. The key here to me is the blonde woman. Who is she? I'm sure everyone's dead involved in the case now, but they have daughters, granddaughters. Somebody knows something, and I think if that sperm sample is still frozen somewhere, which I don't see why it wouldn't be, right? I mean, they have a whole warehouse filled with unsolved cases. Well, in baggies and boxes. I guess if something's frozen, they'd have to stay frozen for 62 years. So maybe I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but it would just be interesting if they tested that out to see, what the hell happened. Who is it linked to? I think now, even to this day, somebody knows something. Information was passed down. Somebody has got to know something. I recommend getting My Dark Places, reading it, read it a few times like I did. Well, I read the whole thing once, but then I skipped over some of his personal stuff, and I just read over the crime portions of it, the murder and the evidence and the witnesses. I read that a lot. I highlighted it a lot. I watched Feast of Death a lot. Excuse me. But this case has become one of those cases that I latched onto, like an OJ case, Lacey Peterson, Casey Anthony, But those cases are very popular. This case isn't nowhere near as popular as those cases, but it's still very intriguing. And it's one of those ones that I latched onto and kind of became a student of. Being that it's unsolved, it's going to remain intriguing, right? Unsolved cases seem to be a lot more intriguing than solved ones, just because there's so many options you can go with, so many scenarios that you can go with that you don't know, so your mind can just wander and wander. And I think that's what keeps it alive. But it would be nice to have an answer, for James, because though it shaped his writing, it shaped who he's become in life, it's still a very tragic case, and I think for him it would be nice just to have some answers before he passes away. He's 72 now. He's still got some years left, but I would really like for him to find out what happened and who did it, maybe even why. So if anyone happens to see this, has any answers or any kind of tips or anything along those lines, leave a comment. Or if you have any information that I was wrong about, or maybe you heard different, leave a comment. Let's talk about it. They did do an Unsolved Mysteries episode about it with Robert Stack, which was interesting. They shot it over on Maple for the interior shot, where the little boy, who was James Ellroy, is in the kitchen with his mother, and then they shot on the exterior of that same property when James Ellroy was sent home in a cab. His dad used to send him back home in a cab on the weekend. So Ellroy pulls up in a cab to his house, to his mother's house there, and there's already cops and investigators waiting out front. And James said he already knew in his mind that she was dead. She'd been murdered. And it's not a retrospective memory, he said, either. He said that's what he felt at the time. And he was calculating his advantages. He really didn't mourn at that time. He was just calculating the fact that, hey, I can live with my dad now. He was 10, so your whole thought process is going to be different. Also, when him and Detective Stoner got together, James was able to go through the actual evidence. He actually held in his hands the stocking and the Venetian cord that strangled his mother, and he even said it was cinched down to 3 inches around her neck. 3 inches on a 17-inch long cord. Now that's the one that broke, and the killer used Jean's right stocking to finish the job. He also said he held his mother's dress that she died in, smelled it. He could smell her. I mean, we're talking at that time, I believe it was 36 years later. That is something I'd never want to know how that feels. Like, it's something, as intrigued as I am about it, I would never want to know or have that feeling of, wow, this is the dress my mother wore when she was killed, And it just stings a lot more when you don't know who did it or why. Answers. We need answers. I don't know if that, like I said, that sperm sample to me is key. And I just wonder if it's still sitting around somewhere. They also collected some carpet-like fibers. I think they were white carpet-like fibers underneath some of her fingernails. That's probably not going to do any good. That's probably from the guy's car. We have a timeline. We know she was at Stan's Drive-In just after 10. Then she was seen at the Desert Inn before 11. 2 witnesses said they saw the swarthy man and Jean leave the Desert Inn at 2 a.m. And then Levon Pinky Chambers, waits on them again at Stan's Drive-In at about 2:30ish. And then her body's found at 10 in the morning the next morning. So I know James's father suggested that it was a 3-way that went wrong. At first, James suggested that they had sex consensually, and Jean wanted to hang out more, wanted more and more and more, and the guy was just tired of it and ended up killing her. But Detective Stoner thought different. Because she had a tampon in her and it was her menstrual phase, the guy, according to Detective Stoner, in his theory, in his opinion, still wanted sex from her, and she didn't want to give it up. So he killed her, after he had sex with her and dumped her there. Was she killed on Kings Row? Was she killed elsewhere and then dumped on Kings Row? There are so many questions. When did the blonde find out about it? Was the blonde there? Was the blonde in a second car? Was it a three-way that went wrong? Was the blonde in the car with them too? Did the blonde help dispose of the body? Or did the blonde just go home after the Desert Inn? So for James Ellroy's sake, I do hope we get some answers. Thank you for joining me on this first true crime episode of the 2S Horror Quarters podcast. And be safe out there, everyone. Thank you. Here at the Inglewood Cemetery. And here she is. Just want to pay our respects to her. May you rest in peace, Geneva, Jean, Hilliker, Ellroy.